All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Thursday, December 26th. I'm a bit spent after this Christmas holiday, so what are we talking about this week?
Yeah, so this episode is going to come out the first week of January. Like you said, we are recording it on the 26th, the day after Christmas, and hope everyone's Christmases out there were wonderful and safe and you know rejuvenating in some ways. It's kind of an exhausting season with everyone's running around and you have work and family and travel and all sorts of things. But we hope people are able to find some time to rest, reflect, and in some ways, all of the family time can and friend time can be rejuvenating. So we hope that for everybody. Happy New Year, to everyone out there. All right, what we're going to talk about today is antitrust legislation. So it sounds super interesting, I know, but hear me out. We've talked about this before that now that the election cycle has come and gone, we want to spend a little more time just delving into issues that perhaps that we are interested in but haven't talked that much about. And today is one of those issues. I've long been circling this issue in my head, Ricky, because I truly don't know how I feel about antitrust legislation. I'm someone that anyone that's listened to this podcast for any period of time knows that I love free market capitalism. I love competition, but antitrust legislation doesn't really fit cleanly into one of those boxes for me. When companies get too big and create monopolies, that leads to less competition. I don't like that. On the other hand, when companies grow and acquire new businesses, that seems to me like a credit to those companies. That's a product of good competition. You're able to grow because you do something better. And that's where the Biden administration these last 4 years and the incoming Trump administration both seem to be like in favor of antitrust legislation and kind of anti-big companies. And I want to learn more about that. So I'm coming into this conversation a totally open mind in order to have the conversation with an expert. We're going to be joined by an expert, and that expert's going to be Robert Levy, Bob Levy, who we'll give a bigger introduction when he comes on. But he's a legend. Was the chairman of the Cato Institute for years. He was also the CEO of his own business for 25 years. So he's going to come at this from the perspective of both a businessman, a CEO of a large company, but also as like a constitutional law expert. And really, I don't think we could ask for a better guest on this topic.
Yeah, I'm excited. I feel like this is one of those things that is a bit confusing to
Yeah.
when you read about certain cases in the news, but obviously is really impactful to daily life. So I'm looking forward to hearing Bob.
Yeah, I think it's going to be. I feel we're going to go on a journey. I'm going to go on a journey today, Ricky. I hope you come along with me and just try. And we're going to try to learn as much as we can about this, and then maybe at the end we'll have a better sense of how we feel about antitrust legislation and what's going on. So, without further ado, let's bring on Bob. All right, we're now thrilled to welcome Robert A. Levy into the program. Robert was the chairman for 14 years of the board of directors at the Cato Institute. He joined Cato as a senior fellow in constitutional studies in 1997 after having a full career in business. The Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies is named in his honor. Bob received a PhD in business from the American University in 1966, which is the same year he founded CDA Investment Technologies, which was a major provider of investment information and software. He served as the CEO of that company until 1991, when he entered George Mason Law School, where he was the chief articles editor of the Law Review and the class valedictorian. He received his JD from George Mason in 1994. Then he went on to clerk for 2 years in the U.S. District Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit before taking over as the chairman of the board of directors at the Cato Institute. He also spent time as an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University. His writing has appeared in all of the major kind of publications in the country, the Times, the Journal, the Post, the USA Today, National Review, and he's appeared on, like I said, all the major news networks as well. So we feel tremendously grateful that Bob is joining us today. So Bob, just kind of wanted to start by talking really generally, from your perspective, what's the purpose of antitrust legislation?
Well, first, it's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. Antitrust legislation is purportedly to help consumers, to prevent anti-competitive behavior on the part of businesses, mostly large businesses, and to stop them from engaging in practices which will end up being to the detriment of their customers.
All right. So one thing that I have long struggled with mentally is, in some ways, I just kind of intuitively understand that when there are fewer businesses in the marketplace, there's generally less competition, which is worse for consumers. And in that sense, I want more competition. I want more businesses, so I want kind of less big companies. On the other hand, I'm also a fan of, if businesses do something better, if they're providing better services, products to consumers, if they become a giant in the marketplace, that's actually kind of a credit to them if they're providing the best, options for consumers. So what's your advice to me? How do I make sense of that kind of those competing notions in my head?
Well, we have to maximize consumer welfare. That was the original purpose of antitrust. Unfortunately, it's sort of morphed into a uh, program that protects competitors against corporations that are out competing them in the marketplace. That I say is unfortunate because it belies the original purpose of the law and because it doesn't necessarily help consumers. It doesn't necessarily maximize their welfare. So the antitrust laws really have to be constituted in a manner that has as its primary objective the protection of consumers, the assurance that those consumers will be able to access competitive markets and won't be dominated by companies that engage in unfair practices. The purpose of the antitrust law is not to make sure that everybody is able to compete and that everybody is able to succeed. The nature of capitalism is that some firms succeed and some firms fail. And the antitrust laws have to be structured in a manner that allows that to happen.
But like, who decides like what's good for consumers? Who decides that in this market that's not good for consumers versus in this market it's okay for consumers?
Well, presumably the consumers ought to be the folks that decide that issue by their purchases in the marketplace. What we don't want to have happen is for bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., at the Federal Trade Commission and at the Justice Department to act as if they know more than we know about what makes our marketplace transactions redound to our own benefit. Ultimately, consumers rule, not companies, and certainly not bureaucrats in the federal government.
So what role, if any, does the government have in pursuing antitrust legislation then?
The government's role is to protect consumers,
Right,
and
but so when do they step in your mind?
it should do that when there is a monopolist who is exercising so much power that consumers effectively don't have a choice and are at the whim of that monopolist. Now, I hasten to add that in a competitive market, and that's what we have in the United States, this existence of monopoly power doesn't often occur. And to the extent that it does occur, it's mostly because government has created the monopoly on its own. So rather than protecting consumers, the government ends up harming consumers by doing things like subsidizing certain customers, protecting them from competition by issuing tariffs and quotas, giving loans and insurance guarantees and the like. So these are government activities, and the best way to avoid that is for government to stop doing that. We don't need the antitrust laws to bring that about. What we do need is for the government to effectively mind its own business.
All right. So that approach seems out of favor today from kind of the both the current and incoming administrations, which I want to get to in a minute, but I want to go back actually really towards like the foundation of antitrust legislation in the United States. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890, and then you have the administrations of McKinley and then Roosevelt in particular, known as like the trust buster. And he's not only famous for that, but lauded for that. So from your perspective, if we go back to that time in the United States, and obviously the industries have changed at the time, we're really looking at like the railroad industries, or some of like the natural resource industries. Was government intervention needed at that point in U.S. history to break up some of these major corporations?
Well, some argue that government intervention was necessary, and they point to, for example, um, American Telephone and Telegraph, where the government did step in and force American Telephone to divest the baby and form the baby bills, effectively split the company up. But there were counter arguments at the time as well. One was that you have a national marketplace and there are economies of scale, and there's certain disadvantages of compartmentalizing companies, of dividing companies by either by geographic region or by function, that large companies like AT&T had sufficient capital to provide funds for innovative research. And you saw that with Bell Labs, you saw it with Western Electric. And unfortunately, when when that company was dismembered, the research wasn't nearly as easy to finance. And there's some question as to whether the customers really needed that kind of protection. It could have been done without dismembering AT&T by simply providing for interoperability. That is to say, forcing AT&T to be interoperable, usable with other telephone systems, thus opening the playing field for other phone companies to compete. And as we know, there are now plenty of those other phone companies, and we're seeing that in the cell phone area. We don't try to keep Apple out of the market or keep Samsung out of the market. What we do is we insist that they be able to talk to one another, and that's what protects consumers.
Are you seeing kind of corollaries with what's going on, say, with some of the Google antitrust legislation or sort of antitrust type cases that are out there today? The same kind of there exists a single search engine that most people find, and it is actually helpful for consumers to be able to go to one place that has the majority of the information, but that creates some interesting or some perhaps like anti-competitive behavior.
Well, that's a great example because um, the government, as you know, is we don't know what they're going to do to fix the problem, but they've identified an alleged problem. That is that Google has a monopoly because it handles 90% of the search inquiries. And in particular, they condemn Google for paying companies like Apple in order to be the default search engine. But really, the first question that one must ask in assessing the utility of this kind of intervention is who is it that's complaining? Who's being hurt? I mean, after all, companies, uh, there are plenty of companies that are offering search engines, and no consumer is forced to use Google as its search engine, even when Google's the default. Customers can very easily select a different search engine. Meanwhile, there's a huge advantage in having a company like Google, which has spent enormous amounts of money in hiring the right people and developing innovative products, and having that company as the search engine. And if the consumer is dissatisfied with Google's search engine, the consumer can go elsewhere. There are lots and lots of search engines that are available. And yet, the antitrust gurus in Washington, D.C. feel that they have to protect not Google's customers, but Google's competitors. That, I think, is a solution without a problem.
Yeah, I think you sort of hinted at this that the government finds antitrust as an avenue to go after larger companies, not from the angle of antitrust or maximizing consumer welfare, but basically just they have a this is a tool to go after a Google.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, it seems like Ricky mentioned maybe the most famous or infamous example of the Biden administration going after Google, but Google is certainly not alone, right? In the last few years, there have been the Department of Justice and the FTC has had lawsuits against pretty much every major company, whether it's Amazon or Visa or Meta, or I mean, like there was the Kroger's and Anderson, the supermarket example. There was JetBlue and Spirit. It feels like in every major industry, the Biden administrations, again, the DOJ and FTC have filed antitrust legislation, kind of going after these big companies. It's arguably one of the biggest legacies of this administration. Why do you think that this administration has behaved in a way that feels very different than how most previous administrations going back the last 100 years have behaved in this arena?
Well, the administration rejected the decades-long goal of the antitrust laws, which was, as I noted, to maximize consumer welfare. So instead, we have the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission apparently believing that big is self-evidently bad. And so they've embarked on this crusade to pick winners and losers, rescuing companies that can't compete on the merits. So it's more like corporate welfare than it is consumer welfare. And as you noted, Google's not the only instance of this. We got JetBlue can't buy Spirit, and Microsoft is blocked from buying a video game company in Kroger, and their acquisition of Albertsons, and now Nippon wants to buy part of U.S. Steel, and they can't do that. And the administration went after the National Association of Realtors, so on and on and on. Those are just a few of the cases. And frankly, we don't yet know what policies the Trump administration is going to push. So it may not be that there's a huge change in terms of antitrust enforcement. So this is all very unfortunate, but it is, in fact, the state of affairs. Now, why has the administration done that? Frankly, I don't pretend to have any insight into their motivation, but it's not hard to believe that the politicians consider this to be an attractive way to get votes. I mean, this is going after immensely wealthy companies, and immense wealth is not something that most people find to be a characteristic that they like. I frankly don't understand that myself, but nonetheless, that is the state of affairs. So we're talking about political motivations, I think, rather than the economic motivations.
Right. That makes some sense to me because given President Trump's the people that he's going to nominate for these positions, I think Andrew Ferguson's to chair the FTC, Gail Slater at the head of DOJ's antitrust division, and Brendan Carr at the FCC. Like these people, at least from their previous careers and the things that their previous rhetoric, they've largely kind of been anti big corporation as well. So right across these two administrations, it looks likely that a lot of the antitrust policies uh, will be similar. And I guess that's just the sentiment of the times. Like I guess I don't know enough about how it was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but do you see parallels between like the public sentiment then and the public sentiment now?
Not much. I think the sentiment back then was the way that it should be now, and that is the primary goal of the antitrust law should be to protect consumers. Now, that doctrine didn't come to full force until Robert Bork in the in the late 1900s. But nonetheless, we didn't have the antitrust laws enforced back at the beginning in order to promote the welfare of other companies. It was intended to promote the welfare of consumers, and that's the way it should be. Now, it is not the way it is, unfortunately, and I think it's counterproductive right now. Competition is the essential ingredient of capitalism. And so when a company appears to have enough market dominance to discourage its competitors, it's tempting to ask government to step in and remedy the problem by enforcing the antitrust laws. But, the temptation should be resisted, except to, as I mentioned, redress monopoly power that the government itself has created. So the argument for aggressive enforcement is that without constant vigilance by these agencies, the large corporations would ruthlessly destroy their smaller rivals and then end up raising prices. And because of high profits, that would impact negatively consumers. But so when these mega companies grab market share, it seems like there's an obvious need for government intervention. But there's a dark side to all of this. And Former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan summed it up. He said that the antitrust laws are a jumble of economic irrationality and ignorance. So it is the case that free markets, they may not be perfect, but that doesn't justify government policies that make matters even worse.
Arguably the face of this antitrust movement under President Biden's administration has been Lena Khan, who is the chairperson of the FTC. She, I feel like in some ways, is either kind of lionized as this hero of trying to take on these big trust corporations, or vilified as someone that is attacking successful companies. So I'm kind of curious. I think this is the most prominent the FTC has been since I've been paying attention to this. Curious, like what your thoughts are on maybe her in particular or the FTC in general over these past few years.
Well, I don't think these folks working at the FTC, particularly Lena Khan, um, understand how markets work. It's maybe a radical statement to suggest that because these are obviously smart folks and they're trained in economics. But the economic losses from excessive regulation can do a lot of damage to producers and consumers. But nonetheless, the government moves forward in the name of correcting what they perceive to be market imperfections. But what they do is they fail to consider the consequences of government intervention. So they tell us that the government planners know which companies ought to be combined and which ones ought not, and which products ought to be withdrawn from the market, no matter what consumers actually prefer. The problem with that argument is it leads directly to paternalism, the idea that there's some elite core at the FTC that knows our interests better than we do and can regulate our affairs to satisfy our interests better than the marketplace. So the real issue is not whether one product is better than the other product, but who gets to decide? Is it going to be consumers through their preferences that are actuated in the market, or is it going to be these specialists that rate the merits of these various goods and services in various companies? I think when we let government make those decisions and we allow those government decisions to trump the subjective choices of consumers, then that abandons any pretense of a free market. And we then reduce consumer choice to some formalistic appraisal by the FTC or the Justice Department, centering mostly on technical features, despite the fact that products are desired for all kinds of other things like quality and price and service and convenience and a host of other variables.
One aspect of these last 4 years that have kind of gone in some ways hand in hand with the crackdown on kind of big tech or big companies in general has been like inflation over the course of these 4 years. And many people have argued that one of the drivers of inflation over, the past few years has been this quote unquote corporate price gouging, right? You hear that a lot from people like Senator Elizabeth Warren, who would say that it's these big companies that have a dominant share of the marketplace that even when like the supply chain issues were work out, well, the prices didn't drop alongside the corresponding drop in their supply costs, right? So it's because of these kind of greedy corporate companies that are just out trying to line the pockets of their shareholders that has contributed greatly to the inflation that we've suffered from over the past few years. What's the response to something like that?
Well, we have murky statutes and we have conflicting case law coming out of the courts. So the companies, they can never be sure what constitutes permissible behavior. The conduct that you would think would be legal somehow morphs into a antitrust violation. So we have all kinds of normal business practices that are admirable practices, things like price discounts and product improvements and even exclusive contracting. And they, under the current interpretation of the antitrust laws, become violations of law. And you get this catch-22 where the companies are included are accused of monopoly price gouging if they charge too much. But if they charge too little, they're accused of predatory pricing. And then if they charge the same, they're accused of collusion. So how do you get off of that treadmill? It's a very difficult thing, and I think the antitrust laws have been misapplied so that these companies are caught between a rock and a hard place.
Is there kind of maybe a better avenue to look at this, or is it that in the long run the market will just figure itself out, and you may have these sort of blips of anti quote unquote anti-competitive behavior, but it's better to allow the market to correct itself than to insert sort of the hand of the government.
The answer is yes, it's better for the market to be allowed to correct itself. That is not equivalent to saying that the market never makes mistakes. It's not equivalent to saying that justice is ubiquitous and that we have resolved all of the problems and inequities that it can exist in a capitalist society. What it is to say is that, however infirm that sometimes free markets can be, they end up producing the very best results for consumers. So the proper frame of reference is not some utopian, perfectly competitive environment that you get in the economics textbooks. That's not the frame of reference. The frame of reference is what we now have with a predominantly free market versus what we would have if we allowed the government to intervene excessively using the antitrust laws to stifle innovation and to stop consumers from making the choices that they would like to make.
All right, so I want to go back and credit to you suggested this question, but Adam Smith, who's kind of this godfather hero of capitalists and free market believers, just a big fan of competition, obviously, but he has this quote that says, quote, "When people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices." So this is often held up as an example of like, look, even this guy, the writer of The Wealth of Nations, that kind of in some ways laid much of the foundation for free market capitalism that we've enjoyed in the last 150 plus years, even he says there needs to be some sort of balance here. We can't just let these companies run amok. We do need to have some sort of laws and regulations around that. So if even he's saying that, isn't there a fair argument for a government role in making sure that we're reducing barriers to competition?
Yeah. Well, I would not characterize what he said as equivalent to saying that because of these meetings that conspire against the public, we definitely need government intervention. That's not what he said. What he said was these meetings will occur. There are such meetings. We have to recognize that there are such meetings, or what he called contrivances to raise prices. But the very next sentence in the Wealth of Nations says, I'm quoting now, it is impossible indeed to prevent such meetings by any law which could either be executed or would be consistent with liberty and justice. So I couldn't agree more. Again, it's not that the markets are flawless. It's not that private competitors don't sometimes behave in a manner that's destructive of consumer welfare. But it is that this outcome, as rare as it may happen, doesn't lead to results that are remediable by government intervention. So this is a far better environment, notwithstanding its flaws, than would be government mandates, government dictates as to which products will survive, which companies will survive, which businesses are too big, which businesses have to be reined in.
From a big picture perspective, do you think that the United States, and I know this is, again, this is like a way zoomed out, are we competitive enough right now? Are our markets competitive?
Well, no, they're certainly not as competitive as I would like to see because we have government imposed uh, processes, public policies that in fact impair competition. And the incoming administration is a perfect example of that. Uh, President-elect Trump insists that tariffs are the best word in the English language. I mean, what is there that could be more anti-competitive than to impose tariffs in order to protect domestic manufacturers against foreign competition? That's the very essence of non-competition. And again, it's the government that's bringing this about. It's not the marketplace that's failing. It's government intervention that's failing. And so we're soon going to find out if Trump goes through with these tariff proposals. We're going to find out that some of the companies, and by the way, it's domestic companies that end up paying the tariffs. In most cases, it's the importer that pays the tariff. So we're going to find out that some of these importers, or for that matter, even if it's the exporter that pays the tariff, some of them are going to pass along those tariff increases in the form of higher prices. Now, they could pass it along by less profits. They could pass it along by paying their employees less. But there's at least a good chance that they'll pass it along in terms of higher prices. So these tariffs are not only going to be anti-competitive, but they're going to be inflationary. And the way in which we'll know they're inflationary is whether or not we see price increases overall, not just in the products that are subject to the tariff, but if the price elasticity of those products is such that consumers end up buying less of those products, then the price increases in the tariff products will not be offset by price reductions in other products. Instead, they'll be offset by less overall trade. And that, of course, is not what government intends, and it's not certainly what government ought to be doing.
Can you talk a little bit about the concept of the static marketplace as it relates to anti-competition and antitrust, sort of the cases and maybe the frame of reference that the government has when they go forth with these cases?
Yeah, so real markets are not the textbook definition of perfectly competitive markets. Real markets, sellers are seeking every single day to carve out these mini monopolies. That's exactly what they're doing by improving products and by innovating and by lowering prices or better service or on and on. So the profits that arise when these companies are successful at developing some market power, those profits are the engine that drives the economy. And again, what happens in this perfectly competitive environment is irrelevant to the question whether government intervention is necessary or appropriate. The proper comparison is against the market that's going to evolve at the antitrust laws, punish success, and eliminate incentives for new and improved products. The markets move faster than the antitrust laws could ever move. Consumers rule, and consumers can unseat any product and any company, no matter how powerful, no matter how entrenched. All you have to do is ask Word Perfect or Lotus, or for that matter, Polaroid. They're perfect examples of entrenched companies with market power, nonetheless um, treated by consumers in a manner that assures that their competitive rivals are going to produce other products that consumers prefer.
When it comes to these sort of the large tech companies that have been sort of the targets du jour, um, what role, if any, does government have in terms of managing the influence that some of these companies may have? And I mean, I think you spoke eloquently a bit about the political angle, and I feel like maybe a broader story of that is that there's just concern that these companies now have more influence than politicians or other so kind of elected figures. So there's something undemocratic about it.
Well, under the antitrust law, I mean, one test for government intervention, again, with the goal being consumer welfare, but it's whether there are barriers to entry that foreclose meaningful competition. Um, but the threshold question, of course, is what constitutes a barrier. So again, when the company does things that are uh, perfectly legitimate, like advertises or lowers prices or adds features, it discourages its rivals, but it can't bar them. True barriers arise from the government, not from private power. They arise out of this special interest legislation or some misconceived regulatory regimen that protects existing producers. And I'm talking about, I may have mentioned a couple of things, but targeted tax benefits, subsidies, insurance guarantees, loans, obviously quotas and tariffs. The same that creates the same anti-competitive environment that allegedly the antitrust laws were meant to foreclose. So that's how barriers to competition, they're born and nurtured at public expense. And the obvious answer is for government to stop that, stop doing that. And as far as um, social media, I think you mentioned Facebook. Um, the first step in applying the antitrust laws, and this applies even if um, your standard is protectionist rather than consumer welfare, the first step is you have to define a relevant marketplace. And that step determines when, whether, and the extent of government intervention. So let's consider social media. Is Facebook so dominant that its customers are harmed and its rivals are somehow snuffed out? Well, hardly. I mean, we have billions of users patronizing social media alternatives such as TikTok and Twitter and YouTube and LinkedIn and on and on. So, and remember that Facebook is a zero price service, and advertising on social media is more available and less expensive than advertising has ever been. The relevant market, of course, is not only, even if we were considering social media, the relevant market is not only social media. Facebook's mission is to communicate with its customers and to provide a forum for the exchange of information. So that same mission, considered broadly, describes not just social media, but also television, radio, newspapers, magazines, direct mail, movies, books, you name it. So within that spectrum, that huge spectrum, which companies comprise the relevant market for the regulators to look at? Frankly, I don't think there is a definitive answer to that. I think it's ridiculous to say that Facebook has a monopoly, or for that matter, Google or Apple or what used to be Microsoft's pervasive impact in the PC market, which
All right,
no
Bob.
which no longer exists.
Yeah. You've been super generous with your time. Just, I guess, maybe one or two final questions for
Sure.
you. The first is, and we've noted this kind of throughout the conversation, where you have the Biden administration kind of there's obviously a lot of discontent, unrest with the current economic situation in the United States. Like that's what, to me, it's one of the major takeaways from these last few election cycles. So the Biden administration and a lot of people on the left point to these big companies as kind of the culprits here. And then you have the incoming Trump administration and some people on the new right that point to other countries as the kind of the culprits of why people are upset, why people the wages aren't as high or people don't have the same type of jobs or purchasing power that they had in days gone by. So whether you're pointing to Google and Amazon and Microsoft or Meta as like the big villains here, or you're pointing to China and Mexico and Canada and Brazil as the villains, like these are ideas that seem to be they're similar, right? The villains are slightly different, but the kind of the ideology behind the thinking and the policies are similar to me. So it seems like these ideas are in the ascendancy, and ideas like yours of less antitrust legislation, fewer tariffs, these ideas are not as popular. And to me, it seems like because it's when people are struggling, it's easy to be able to point to someone, right? You point to Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, or you point to China or Mexico or Canada and say like they're the problem. So it seems to me a little bit of a messaging issue for people that share your ideas in terms of like we need actually less government intervention in order to have a better outcome for you as an individual. So have you thought about that? And if so, how do you and people who share your beliefs do a better job marketing those ideas?
Well, at first, you're absolutely right. This definitely is a messaging problem. Of course, one cure, um, not the one that I would favor, but one cure is progress through catastrophe. So yeah, these ideas are in the ascendancy that corporations are evil and wealth is to be condemned, and that government is our savior. But sooner or later, we do find out that that's not the case, and that exactly the opposite is the case. That free markets produce better outcomes, and government is more frequently than not the source of problems rather than the source of solutions. So yes, we do have to sell that better. How do we sell it better? Well, at the Cato Institute, that's exactly what our mission is, you know. So what do we do? Well, we write op-eds and other policy papers. We try to make those available to not just the policymakers, you know, Congress and the Supreme Court and the executive branch, but we try to make it available to high school teachers and students and college educators. And not just writing, but we do a lot of speaking, a lot of media work. We testify before state and federal legislative bodies, and generally try to spread that message as broadly as we can. Have we been successful? Well, in part, not as successful as we need to be, but it won't be for lack of effort. So if you want to know what we should be doing, we are doing what we should be doing. I wish we were a lot more successful at it, but again, we're trying our best. And every day there are folks at Cato and other free market organizations that are attempting to spread this message. I frankly think that the best way is from the bottom up. So we got to get these kids in high school to understand how markets work and to understand that the benefits that are produced by markets are a feature of capitalism, and that all they have to do is to look at Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, the Soviet Union, and they'll find out what the socialist paradise has been able to produce.
As a former teacher and current middle school debate coach myself, I this rings true to me, and I got plenty of kids out there, Bob. I'll tell you that are that are learning those ideas. Last question, different topic here, but one thing I didn't mention about your bio was that you were the co-counsel on the landmark case in District of Columbia v. Heller, which for people that don't know out there was, like I said, a landmark Second Amendment case in which the court found that Washington, D.C.'s law banning or regulating gun ownership, they found that it was unconstitutional. It was a huge case, and rare do you have the opportunity to speak directly to someone that was such a large part of it. So you've seen obviously the legacy of the Heller case in the last 16 years, I mean, particularly I mean, recently culminating in the N1 New York versus Bruin case. Now that you've had some time to look back on it, do you have any thoughts about how gun regulation has evolved over these last 16 years and what the court has done in terms of gun regulation?
Well, the process was intended to be and did what did happen to be a three-step process. Step one was defining what the Second Amendment meant. Was it a right for people to serve in a militia and carry arms as part of their service, or was it a broader right that included such things as self-defense, the ability to carry a weapon individually? And the Heller case resolved that. So the court's conclusion was that there is an individual right to keep and bear arms that need not be exercised, although could be exercised in the context of militia service. So that was question number one. Question number two is, where does the Second Amendment apply? So as it happens, when the Constitution was originally ratified, 1789, it only applied to the federal government. So if you read the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say about free speech, for example. It doesn't say anything about the states making laws. So presumably the state of Florida could have passed a law that says you can't criticize a governor. That may have violated the Florida Constitution, but it wouldn't have violated the U.S. Constitution. So the Second Amendment, like all the rest of the Bill of Rights, didn't apply to the states back in the framing era. Well, we found out that the states can be just as tyrannical as the feds, slavery being the obvious case on point. So we fought a civil war, and then after the Civil War, we ratified the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was used, the technical term is incorporate, basically means to apply the Second Amendment so that it did govern the activities of the states. So the federal government was given a new power. If the federal government determined that states were violating parts of the Bill of Rights, the federal government could intervene. So that was part two, to find out where the Second Amendment applied. By the way, that didn't all happen when the 14th Amendment was ratified. It happened step by step. So there would be a lot of cases involving free speech, and then free exercise of religion, and then protection against unreasonable searches. And until 2010, the court hadn't gotten around to the Second Amendment. So after the Heller case, it took another 2 years for the McDonald case for the court to decide that, yes, the Second Amendment, like most of the other provisions in the Bill of Rights, did in fact apply to state government. So that was part two. Part one, what's it mean? What's the Second Amendment mean? Part two, where does it apply? Part three, what's the scope of the right? And that's what we're now involved in. And that has, unfortunately, from my perspective, evolved in a manner that I would not have predicted and that I don't favor. And I blame that on the Bruin case. I think the Bruin case is wrongly decided. Basically, the Bruin case, for your listeners, rejects this look at public safety versus the individual right that's been guaranteed under the Second Amendment. That was the way in which Second Amendment cases were originally post-Heller. We're going to be examined, look at public safety. If there's a strong enough reason for public safety and the government comes up with some very tightly tailored law, then that'll be okay. You can bar teenagers from having an automatic weapon in front of the White House when the president is giving a walk on the lawn. There's nothing, no question, but there's some weapons, some situations, and some persons can be regulated. But Bruin dispensed with that effort. And Bruin said, now what we're going to do is we're going to look solely at history and tradition and find out, is there a law back in the framing era that is close enough an approximation to the law that we're now examining? And if there is, we're going to let this law continue. And if there isn't, we're not going to allow it. That I think is the wrong framework. I regret that the court did that. I hope the court will rein in Bruin and revert to its previous posture of examining public safety on the one hand versus the scope of the individual right on the other.
Well, that was fascinating. I'm glad I asked that question. Uh, Bob, if you mentioned kind of earlier that there are places where if people are interested in your ideas in particular, or just kind of learning more about some of these debates in general, that they could go. So could you just identify those places for us?
Yeah, well, the first place would be the Cato website, um, cato dot org. Um, you won't find much nowadays about the positions that I advocate because I'm retired. But Cato has a wonderful staff, pushing 200 people that are devoted every day to uh, free markets, defending private property, and securing individual rights, and most of all, limiting the powers of government in accordance with our Constitution. So I would look on the Cato website for starters. And there are other free market organizations that have excellent websites that are good sources of free market thought. And there are some that are represent themselves as nonpartisan, non-ideological. I'd encourage people that are interested in the Constitution to look particularly at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. They have a wonderful website with a course called Constitution 101, which is designed for non-lawyers, for people that want a fundamental understanding of what the Constitution is all about. They do a great job, and I think it'd be a wonderful thing for young people in particular to take a look at that website.
Wonderful. You can also go check out Bob. He's got his own channel on YouTube if you want to get more into his personal beliefs. But Bob, thank you so much. You've been more than generous with your time and expertise. This is really, we feel really lucky to have been able to talk with you and to hear from you. So thank you so much.
Great to be with you. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Wow, what a legend Bob Levy is. He's just lived an incredible life, incredibly consequential life in business and in law, and just kind of like being an American citizen. So really feel fortunate that he joined us tonight at all and spent so much time with us. Ultimately, Ricky, it did for me what I hoped that it would do was clarify some of these issues for me because this was, and so I said, in the opening and what I said in my first question is like I came into this like really open-minded, like wanting to know more about this stuff where I did really have like competing conceptions in my head of antitrust law. Is it good for competition or not? And I guess like it should be quite clear that Bob is coming at this from like a distinct point of view, right? Like we could interview someone else that could maybe make a really good case that antitrust law is good for competition, but at least coming out of that conversation, and as someone that obviously his many of his views hew closely to my own, like that's I was looking for that clarification, and I feel good about it. I particularly liked at the end, like when he was able to kind of weave together some of the Biden administration's policies with the Trump administration's policies of ultimately these are all government intervention that is they're like choosing winners and losers, whether those winners and losers are domestic companies or foreign companies versus domestic companies. And ultimately, I think I agree with that. But I'll let you hop in here. But it does there is something that just kind of viscerally speaks to it when you see companies that have these market caps of trillions of dollars in some cases and you see these individuals that are worth billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and that just doesn't in some ways it just doesn't feel right. It feels like something must be wrong with the system that allows that to happen. And I guess that maybe that's maybe a philosophical debate we can have, but his point about what we're really looking at is making sure that consumers have options and that it's the best possible thing for consumers. That rang true with me, and I feel like I learned a lot tonight.
Yeah, I think the notion of you hear about antitrust and you immediately think about okay, what we need to preserve is a competitive market. And his frame that I think he started with and really hammered home the point for me is like, no, the point of antitrust law is to ensure that markets can maximize consumer welfare. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have the most competitive market. And I think he basically like outlined some cases where like it doesn't make sense necessarily for a bunch of different companies to be doing the same kind of thing when a single consumer can get benefit from one company that does all these things in like an interconnected way. And that I think is something to think about. And then I think to your point about how it has been wielded is something that I'm also like not necessarily comfortable with, right? Like obviously, as someone who's Hughes left, the immense concentration of wealth and influence that some of the huge, folks in the tech sector, I mean, you can look back historically,
Yeah.
has always been a bit troubling. And yet, the notion that governments might come in and just break them up as if that is the problem is also concerning, especially if it doesn't have like, okay, how does breaking them up make it any better for consumers? It almost feels like if the huge concentration of wealth and influence is the problem, we go with taxes. Like that's how.
Yes, there's a different manner to kind of insert the government if that's what you want to do,
Yeah.
right? There's a
Yeah.
different manner than the antitrust laws. And I think he made that point that these are being wielded politically to kind of score points because those, as I said in one of my questions, like that's those ideas are popular right now. I was just trying to think because we named a lot of big companies that the Biden administration has pursued antitrust legislation and lawsuits against. I want to kind of contrast two. One is, and I mentioned this, the JetBlue Spirit merger that the government essentially killed in the name that there would be less competition in the marketplace, and so there'd be fewer options for consumers. And like what ended up happening is Spirit filed for bankruptcy. You know what I mean? Like now, oh well, now we just lost one of the airlines completely. All right, cool, right? Like that seems like clear, like a cut off your nose to spite your face type thing. It's like, all right, we prevented this merger, and now that company can't exist anymore, and so now there's going to be fewer options for like fewer cheaper options for consumers. Like that seems to me like a prime example of what you don't want government to be doing. On the other hand, the government hasn't necessarily fully pursued this like lawsuit yet or this line of inquiry, but like Live Nation has been a big issue over these past couple of years. Chiefly, it rose to its kind of greatest prominence when they had the Taylor Swift debacle about their tickets. But Live Nation is, I think, a major issue. But what we saw there, Ricky, is consumers were really upset about that. And that's what Bob was kind of saying is consumers have talked enough that saying, like, I can't get into these marketplaces because the fees, because Live Nation owns Ticketmaster, right? When you own the company that sells the tickets and you also own all of the venues, there's no room for competition. And there you can essentially do whatever you want. And if you want to see these artists, like you have to kind of just play the game. And if you're an artist, if you want to play these venues, you have to play the game. That to me seems like a prime example of like, all right, we could use some government intervention here, but why? Because they aren't providing the optimal experience for a consumer. So that's what I was trying to get at. And as he was talking, I was thinking about this, and now I feel like at least I have like examples of differentiation for like good government intervention versus bad government intervention.
Yeah, and I think that is, I think those are two like really helpful examples in terms of figuring it out. But it is confusing, right? Like I liked how he kept referencing the the market capitalism that exists is not that ideal free market that exists in the economic textbooks where firms have basically no transaction cost to enter and exit and consumers have basically unlimited choice, right? As you said, if they own the venues and then they own the ticketing platform, then like to build another venue is a very difficult process, and in some of these big cities, more or less impossible, right? There's a potential issue there for consumers because they don't have any choices and they know it. And obviously, like Ticketmaster's putting those like 25% service fees on online ticket sales, and you're just like, what in the world is going on right now? But that like begs the question, right? Like over the long run, could you see some people getting together in a collective and like paying for a venue and like to right so we I mean we have a similar issue with our electric power industry where it didn't make sense for them to run like competing power lines, one next to each other. And so we said, okay, in certain places we've gone with this exercise of deregulation where, okay, the guys who own the power lines can't own the power production, and so people are just allowed to choose who they buy the electricity from and they pay a fee to use the lines, and then those profits are regulated by sort of the government. How much money can they make allowing people to use these lines? How has that worked out? Like I think a lot of the and right we had a similar sort of deregulation in the airline industry, but it didn't promote, tons of new people buying airplanes because at some point there's only so much demand, and like if you're flying empty planes, you're losing a lot of money. And so I think it is just in general like a good philosophical exercise
Yeah,
and like, yeah, I believe in these things, but I see the limitations in certain places. And, we've seen healthcare industry and other avenues where it doesn't work out. I thought I was really like with him all the way until like the parting pot shots at Nicaragua and Cuba. I was like, how is that like a helpful comparison? But anyways, I won't delve too much into where I think there are opportunities for government intervention. But I think like largely I agreed with most of what he said, and that the problem is like, yeah, these like solutions in search of problems, basically. Like we don't, yeah.
I like that line. All right, last thing I want to leave you with, and I like to highlight stuff like this because I think it's a useful thought exercise. Because today you look at these companies like an Amazon or a Google or an Apple or something like that, and you just they're such behemoths, right? You almost can't imagine how they ever won't be like the biggest, most successful companies in the world, right? But so Forbes did this thing back in 2017, and they listed the top. They did the top 20. I won't do all that. Actually, they did top 50. But in 1917, top five U.S. companies: U.S. Steel, AT&T, Standard Oil, Bethlehem Steel, Armor and Company. All right, like, all right. Then we go to 1967, so 50 years later, what are the top five companies? IBM, AT&T still, Eastman Kodak, General Motors, Texaco. And then 2017, Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway. Right. And so this is just like that's what happens. Like sometimes you see like these companies that were the biggest companies in the world for decades, 100 years, a whole century, and then times change. He referenced like Polaroid, and I was even thinking like uh, for Zoom, what was the company that was the first to market that should have been Zoom that wasn't? Skype. Skype. I used to have Skype, right? Like Skype was perfectly positioned, and all of a sudden they weren't, right? And so that's thing times change, and I think sometimes I get to be a prisoner of the moment, and you're like, these companies are too big, but that's what people thought. Like, and then times change, the competition comes in, the market changes, the world changes, and I think that's important to keep in mind too. I think a lot of it is really short term. You look at it like this is a problem, we need to fix it, as opposed to, as Bob was kind of saying, like generally the markets tend to work things out.
Yeah. And I generally also don't think that there's a problem with thinking that some of these companies are too big. I think the where it gets tricky is that like, do we apply antitrust legislation to deal with that? And especially in some of the recent things that have been going on, it doesn't always feel apt. I should disclaim before we end this podcast that I work for one of these big companies. I don't really have like a huge like feeling one way or another on the company that I work for or really any of these other ones. But to say kind of what he said, that there's like a public perception that a lot of these companies completely dominate their space, but it is because consumers today choose to patronize them, and they could freely choose to do something else if it was better. It, the fact that they're entrenched, as you would probably say, credit to them, but that
Yeah.
doesn't really like change it. That doesn't mean that that there's like a requirement for a government intervention.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna bring that up, but knowing that, I was like, if your bosses heard this episode, they would probably actually be quite pleased with it.
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, one of the things that I think we're probably aligned. But it also doesn't speak to like that there aren't reasons that, hey, if in general we want to see companies do things like more this way, we want to prevent, 13-year-olds and younger from using social media, that's fine. Put the legislation out there. Not the answer is like we need to end Facebook or whatever.
I agree. Well, that was a really interesting conversation. I think I learned a lot, and this is pretty much how we wanted to start off of the new year here is continue to try to both broaden and deepen the things that we know. So that was a great start. Huge thanks to Bob for coming on. Obviously, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find us on YouTube, like you can find Bob. So we appreciate everyone that listens always.
So thanks, everybody.
I'll see you.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.